Hello and welcome everyone to the Cluster Addons meeting. It is the 26th of November and it's the post-KubeCon meeting. I was really happy to see that folks managed to meet up, and it sounded like you had a good discussion there over lunch. Lee said that Cornelia took some notes. I haven't seen those notes yet. Does anyone want to summarize or maybe say what happened there? Or is everything on the agenda already?
I'd say we did have an excellent meeting. We had lunch and then we broke out afterwards into a meeting room inside because there were too many helicopters flying overhead, helicopters and other assorted military stuff. And it was pretty wide ranging, but I think we basically reached a pretty good consensus around sort of like a shared vision of what we're going to do. We talked a little about a very wide range of topics. So I really hope we can actually get those notes to sort of jog people's memories. It's sort of already gone into a blur to me. I remember being very excited by the idea that like Kube Controller Manager is a like bundle of add-ons in a way, and I thought that was mind-blowing. I think it was Evan, right? But everything is a bit of a blur. But yes, I don't know if anyone else has any recollections.
I know we talked about considering if we could come up with like a common sort of status API or these sort of common embedded extensions that we don't have concretely defined, and trying to learn from Red Hat's experience with like giving those, but maybe try to give very crisp guidance on some of that stuff. And the other thing I remember was talking about the OCI KEP. I think we were going to maybe look at that at this meeting, but it's only been like 2 days, like a day since KubeCon, so like I don't think things have changed. So that may be for after the holiday.
Sorry, I was just trying to type a couple of notes. And it looks like we have a couple of new people on the call as well. Welcome to all of you. I don't know if you want to quickly introduce yourselves or add anything to the agenda, let us know. Yeah, I just checked since the last meeting, we didn't have any other action items, so we're good to go there. And Jeff, you had a document you wanted to talk about. I'm not sure if everyone can see it. I'll share it in the chat here as well.
There's a couple folks in it. If you request, I'll approve, but I need to figure out how to actually make it public. So I met Venu and a few of his colleagues at Fujitsu at KubeCon. Venu's joining us in my top right corner. And Anne is below, who's done some PRs around config map generation and the core DNS operator. And what we sort of identified as an opportunity to collaborate on the core DNS operator. This is something that we right now have talked very sort of library driven and very installer driven, but we have an opportunity to go kind of use case driven here, where these folks have a concrete need to do zero downtime or near zero downtime core DNS upgrades. So I think it's a good opportunity to sort of collaborate around that and learn from, what does it mean to use one of these things in production as well. So I took a first pass at outlining what I think the gap is between what we have as a sort of a functional operator with, just the bare bones stuff that we get from the library it's based off of, to what I think would be something that you could actually run in production. The big addition that we have between open issues that are just already about the operator that we have on GitHub today are adding a smoke test. So something that actually runs and exercises the operator, providing at least a metric, if not a couple of metrics emitted from the operator. And I think we can do that in a way we can share it kind of everywhere. And the big thing I want to add is integrating customized support as well. We have done a few sort of one-offs where we've added I added like the patch functionality that looks like customize. You know, we've talked about adding config map name hashing that looks like customize. But I think we have the opportunity to just wholesale take features or take the customized functionality and sort of integrate it to that existing sort of declarative pipeline, and get all that stuff, you know, for free, so to speak. So my plan with this is to figure out how to better share this doc and keep the requests coming, and then just make GitHub issues for these, and we can just sort of assign and work as folks are interested in working on that. I think a lot of the Fujitsu folks are going to take on some of the customized integration and smoke test stuff, but I think we'll probably share some of that part. We'll see, but that's what this meeting is for, right?
Sorry, just catching up on the context of this doc. Thanks for putting this together.
Oh, it's kind of shared because you guys are popping in. Wait, no, I'm looking at the wrong doc. Yeah.
Yeah, I can see it. I don't know how I can see it, but
I clicked like publish. I don't know. But I had to approve it for Daniel, so I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I changed it so that the Kubernetes dev and C cluster lifecycle people can edit. Yes.
Thank you. I will write those down.
yeah, if you open sharing options, you can see it's shared with 2 groups in addition to specific people.
That's great. I see. From my perspective, like the biggest unknown is exactly what customized integration looks like. I've talked to some folks, and customized is now available for API integration, at least from a level. You can get the same fidelity that you would get by shelling out to customize. That's published. Now, the actual internals of customize, like I want config map renaming, and then I want, you know, name, fix up all the name references, that sort of stuff. If you just wanted to pluck out features like that, that's still coming in customized v4 or O.4. But I think it'd be interesting to see if what they have today with basically being able to customize build is enough. And I think we can get some stuff to work there.
What specifically are the use cases that we're trying to pick up? Sorry, I might have missed that.
Yeah, I think the high level bit is it seems like we want to imitate a lot of the customized features, things like patch and config map, hashing and name generation. So I was hoping that we could just pick up customize as a step in the pipeline, maybe the final step where we you know, reconstruct a manifest that customize knows, or maybe we tag each one of the objects with the file it was in if it was based off a customized file, and then give the opportunity to run customized build against it as the final step.
Got it. So it's config map renaming is the main new feature, and then in general, like it seems like we should not be rewriting customize.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah, I was like, oh, I could do config map rename, but then we got to change all these back references, and oh, here's code, you know.
Right. Cool.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, certainly it's a longer journey, right, to like go beyond the customized docs and then get into vendoring it and figuring out like what code interfaces are supported. And, so I haven't taken even the first step on that journey for the kubeDM implementation. Just shelling out has been the initial strategy.
It looks like they've come a long way in making that integration possible, and they now have a really a small API to integrate. I think my biggest open question, and I want to prototype, like I plan on spending some more design time on this in the next week, and I want to prototype it working. But my biggest open question is just how do we imitate the file system to customize? because, we detach the concept of loading the manifest because we want to be able to source it from anywhere. And Kustomize expects a file system layout. So if you provide us a file system to load from, it's easy to say like, okay, well, maybe here's where all the files are. But I think that's where it could get messy and weird. So I want to prototype that before like really going down the path.
I also believe that there's some room, like if you're going to build that ecosystem integration for loading, right, that some of those should then get upstreamed back into the CLI's UX, right?
Yeah,
So that's like, oh yeah, if you want to source from an OCI image, you should go from there. If you want to source from an HTTP source and use that as a resource, then like that has some implications, and they may or may not be desired for the command line. But we can do whatever we want, obviously, as a library. I was actually thinking for the add-on installer portion of the API, right? Like we want inline patches so that those things can be easily captured without users doing weird stuff on a file system or having to clone repos and stuff. And also an interesting detail is that there isn't like the git clone is not built in Go. It's shelling out from the Kustomize implementation internally. So you shell out to Kustomize and Kustomize shells out to Git, which is fine, but just adds dependencies, to kubeadm for inflating those things when it's probably not super necessary. And I like just thinking of weird things like, oh, okay, well, I could wrap the base that's referenced in the API like with a just-in-time file system, like real customized directory, right? And then post in the patches there and build the customized YAML so that the CLI tool behaves properly with these inline patches when you exec it. And it starts to get, like pretty ugly, right? And so you can't just like bolt on additional patches when you inflate, which might be kind of a nice command line flag, honestly. So it's like, oh, well, I don't want to,
like a set of inline patches.
Yeah, I don't want to inflate this thing, or I don't want to fork this thing, right? But I want to just apply these inline patches with whatever the upstream thing is, and hopefully it works, right? But I don't know if that fits in with like the explicit declarative recommendations.
It'd be a great dev experience. I can say that for sure, because it's always weird to like develop a patch for the first time.
Yeah.
But if I could just cat it from standard in or something, pipe it might be nicer.
Yeah.
In like a CI, like everything is ultimately tied together with a bash script somewhere. So
yeah,
having this defined in there would be useful.
Yeah. So like I can imagine, right? Okay, I'm trying to use this upstream like customized package of manifests, and like it's doing something that I don't want it to do. Like, it's creating a load balancer is a common one, right? It's like, wait, we don't do that in my infrastructure. Like, stop that. And then like having to patch that out. And then all of a sudden it's like you have this very simple need. And while it's possible to patch out, it's like, okay, well now I've got to go like fork the manifests somehow. So it's not super hard to do. You write some files and then it references it, but it might be, doing that programmatically feels weird.
Yeah, it feels like really artificial. Like it feels.
Mm-hmm. You're like, okay, well, I'm going to pretend to be a user using this command line tool, right? And kind of morph my own API using files in a temporary directory. So those are certainly cases, right, where it's like you become much more inspired to actually use the library and deal with the storage part yourself. I don't know if that's insightful for the operator implementation, But if we could have some convergence there in like how we're using the library and what APIs we're using to drive those things, then that could have some nice interop. Right?
Makes sense. Another, let's just was clicking through the doc, and Evan pointed out that the QBuilder folks are talking about doing a smoke test, which is another good interop opportunity potentially. Evan, do you have any more info on that, or just like it's like hallway talk?
It's kind of hallway talk. I know they were talking to the people who wrote the Kudo operator, which is like a meta operator for installing operators. And they have a good test framework. And so there were discussions like, can we extract just your test framework and make that part of KubeBuilder? I don't know where that went, but they're the beginnings of talks, and I think it's worth collaborating with them.
Yeah, that'd be good to find out. I can maybe poke them and find a little more about that, because I don't want to invent a thing if they're going to make a real thing, if the thing already exists.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. I'm super excited to see this generally because it's like using it for real, but as we use it for real in like COPS for KubeADM, for example, we may also be able to leverage their test. It would not be a smoke test, but it would be an integration test, I guess.
That's a great point.
I would say they're also interested in the OCI bundling of add-ons, KubeBuilder, artifacts, what have you. So there's some overlap there as well.
Jeff, do you want any more feedback, or do you need help with anything?
I think my action item here is to flesh out these ideas a little bit more and then create some GitHub issues. And as folks are, I would love feedback on the more concrete items once they're up there. But it sounds like this idea is not crazy. I've got that as a takeaway, so I'm happy to hear that. And I think we can start designing and iterating on this stuff. So thank you.
Excellent. Evan, you also had an agenda item.
Yeah, I did. This came out of our discussion at KubeCon. Let me share my screen if I can. There we go. So this is just a very quick design doc for maybe what a super minimal MVP on cluster representation of an add-on might be. This is something that overlaps with a lot of things we've been thinking about for sort of the OpenShift and OLM side of things. So it seems like we've already thought about this a bunch. Let's just see what everyone else thinks. Is this something that we can build for add-ons as a way to do feedback or not? So the basic idea is this. First off, this all happens after your add-on is installed. So this doesn't really affect any of the installation part. It doesn't affect the operator writing part really. This is kind of like after it's all there. The idea is that you would put a label on any component of your add-on. So in this case, you'd prefix it with this label prefix and then an identifier. And so you don't create these objects at all yourself, or at least that's not the standard workflow. Instead, you label your objects, and the controller for this generates these for you. And then at its most basic level, let's just collect up what the components are and maybe surface their status conditions. And this is just here's the things that make up this add-on, here's the status of those things at a very high level overview of what's going on in your cluster. We had some other ideas for ways to extend this in the future. Maybe you say, hey, here's how to extract some really useful metadata from the resources that you're selecting over, so that you also have that in your status. And we're still not talking about writing these resources yourself. at least not for this initial proposal. And then, if we want to start doing more complicated aggregation, maybe there's a way to sort of register that as another thing that happens. So that's what some ideas around. What if I want a top level thing that knows that when my deployment is successful and my CRDs are accepted, then my operators, my add-on or operator is good. Those are like some things we could look at in the future. But the idea is like, what if we just write a controller for this guy to start with, and it just collects up the status of the components and knows how to connect up these pieces together. That's kind of the gist of it.
And so the idea here is that we would build stuff that is able to like understand all the cluster add-ons, right? In other words, when we just have the CRDs, we don't really know that they are all add-ons, as it were.
Correct. Yeah. Sorry, I did not correctly contextualize this, but this is getting back to this question of like, how can I tell what add-ons are installed? How can I tell what state they're in? And how can I know whether or not they're healthy in one way or the other? So I don't think this addresses some of the things we talked about of like giving an overall red or green or yellow or green on my add-on. That's something we can maybe build on top. But this is like a first step. Hey, we already have this all this stuff in the cluster. Can we just put it all in one place so that we can query it? Anyone have any like initial gut reactions to this one way or the other?
I recall so this approach is using this single API group version and kind approach, where we have this general API, and then we can write a single controller right on that type, which is appealing. I'm a little curious about how we could, I guess we could have fields that are general enough in here, similar to some of like the cluster API types, where then the add-on operators themselves could interact with and control fields.
Yeah, that's kind of so this idea here for a way to extend this was like, what if we do this in the most generic way possible to start with, just to discover what stuff we might want. And so the idea here was like, hey, here's a label, here's an annotation that tells me how to pull out some values from a CRD spec.
Interesting.
And then that gets aggregated up here on my status again.
Interesting. Very, very interesting.
We haven't implemented this, but it's kind of like, if we were to do this in the most generic way possible, my suspicion is that like what APIs are included is like a standard thing that we just want to extract. And so if we find the CRD kind, we just do this. But I kind of like the idea of like, we could figure out what stuff is important to extract by letting people write their own definitions of what is important to extract.
Yeah, so here you're using the CRD annotation to describe to the cluster add-on controller, which would have RBAC permission to read all of the CRDs in the cluster, about how to behave in response to discovering instances of those custom resources using this label selector on the cluster add-on.
Yeah, well, in this case, we're just talking about the CRD itself. So this isn't really looking at the instances. This is just saying like, hey, this CRD, I can extract this data about what, so like this is the stuff you need from a CRD to make an API call to it, right? So it's like, this is kind of a useful thing to extract, because then if I read this, I mean, you can get the same thing from the CRD itself. But the idea is like, what is useful to surface to some top level object?
Yeah. Should add-ons have like some kind of, well, this gets into some of the API design stuff when we were talking about routines versus things that should have like an install ID. CRDs are very singleton, right? But then some things are not. Singleton in installation. Almost there, I would say, right?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know if this is where you're going with that, but I guess you could be a part of multiple add-ons, right? So if you had, I guess, like two ingress controllers as add-ons,
Yeah.
you could aggregate the ingress, it's not a CRD, but if it were a CRD, you could aggregate the ingress CRD to both ingress controllers that you have.
Yeah, and you could bolt that on with customize when you're installing it. You could enforce an additional annotation or label for everything.
Mhm.
Interesting.
Yeah. I don't remember if there's a thing I think there is in customize where you can just say add this label to everything.
Yeah,
right?
there is a label or an option for that. You can do it on label, namespace, and some other things. Prefixing and suffixing stuff.
So this would be like a relatively straightforward thing to add to the add-on installer, right? You say like,
Yeah, we could say that every add-on gets a unique install ID, right, or any number of things, or ask a user to provide one if they want to differentiate between multiple installs. In the ingress controller one is the great example of that use case where often people want ingresses for different zones, such as internal or external or something that's geosensitive.
right.
Yeah. And, very, very interesting. And this is a little bit of a different approach than we had that ad hoc, or we had those face-to-face conversations about using some of the similar properties of the CRDs and then something outside of kubectl that would then provide a user experience for different CRDs, right, that have things like common fields and a similar category or label. And then,
I think you probably still want a lot of that, right? You probably want like most people who are writing add-ons to probably be using similar libraries to build them with similar statuses and things like that. This is sort of sitting in between all of that and the user.
Justin, I know you've been a little bit of a verbal advocate before for not doing this like single API group cluster add-on approach. Do you have thoughts on how this is put together now that there's like extension points and ways to talk about like building features in?
Yeah, I certainly, it looks like we still have, what I didn't want was I didn't want one CRD for all, like, well, this is complicated. So this has both a CRD for cluster add-on and a per add-on CRD, which is what I really wanted. I wanted the per add-on CRD. This looks like a pattern for, like a design pattern for like, how do we say all of these kinds are instances or subclasses of a cluster add-on in this case. And yeah, we need to figure out what the right pattern is. This looks like a reasonable, good pattern for that. But yeah, like someone else brought up like the category thing, I think on the CRDs, which I think I was certainly mentally bookmarked and will now bring up a tab to inspect. But like the idea of some sort of like other, there are like sub resources. This seems nice. Yeah, it's going to be, in my mind, it's going to be about the, what we do next, like what the use cases are, how we want to interact with this, how users, what we build on top.
Yeah, so there's like a whole discussion of like, should this resource have a spec? And like, if you write into it, should it do a thing with a running operator? I think that's the question. What I was trying to like punt on all of those questions by just saying like, look, it just tells you what's on your cluster, and that's it. And that's like a good starting spot.
I wonder so much if the cluster add-on kind is necessary to run that logic. It probably is a good performance consideration. Like if you've got, like imagining you have 1,000 add-ons, right? It would suck to run add-on CTL and have to compute statuses for every one of those things all the time. Whereas if you have a controller, like it basically you've got caches all the way down. So that makes sense.
Run all this off a cluster instead of on a cluster.
You could do that too, yeah.
I'm certainly inclined to worry less about today's implementation, as it were. Like, we can make if we decide that like we can do something is possible today and suboptimal, but can be made like much more efficient in future. That's the sort of thing we can fix. But yeah, this is also a nice approach in that it doesn't require any change. That doesn't require that work.
So if we were to prototype this and then present it the next time, is anyone like not want to see this happen? Yeah, that's kind of my question. Is like, are we missing the mark? This is exciting to us because it seems like a useful abstraction. But if literally everyone says we don't care about this abstraction, then we probably also don't care about this abstraction. Does that make sense?
To me, I'd want to see the use cases like really spelled out before, you know, that would be my, like, I'm just a little unsure as to what we're really going to do with it, right? Like, it's not clear to me exactly how users interact with it from an installation point of view, from a monitoring point of view. And so that to me would be in order to answer that question correctly, I would need to understand that better.
I think it's largely observability into your cluster, right? It's there are 100 pods. Which of them are add-on pods? You know, there are 30 CRDs. Which of them are related to add-ons, and which pods that are running the add-ons are reconciling those CRDs? It's like really all this.
As like somebody who's operated clusters, like from that kind of persona and experience, I certainly have been frustrated with like the number of things that get installed into kube system. It becomes like a massive mess, right? Like anytime I want to install some serious infrastructure component, I'm like, how can I namespace this thing so I keep it separate, like from everything else? And then that experience of running Helm list in your cluster like provides so much value for somebody who's managing the cluster to like actually understand what is running inside of it, that I feel like that's the driving factor why everyone wants to like give me one package manager. That use case is like, hey, if this is not installed with Helm, I have diminishing hope that I will understand what is installed and I will be able to recover the state of how to do that thing, what decisions were captured in doing that thing. But,
I guess from that perspective, one thing I'd bring up is that that use case is similar to the application CRD, right? And so I'm not aware of the exact status of the application CRD, but like, should we name a cluster add-on or something else that's more open? Should we look at using one of those efforts or figure out what's going on there? But yeah, I accept that. And like, I'd say the alternative, which is unproven, is to have some method of identifying the CRDs and use them as like the CRDs that are applications or add-ons, and use them as grouping objects. But this certainly feels much more natural in today's Kubernetes world, as it were.
I can tell you the application add-on CRD is very close to this, but I don't know what kind of other driving factors behind what that SIG wants to do with applications are orthogonal to what we want to do with cluster add-ons. If they overlap enough, then it makes sense, but that also has its own set of like tech debt along with it. So yeah.
I think in particular, one of the big differences was that you have to know ahead of time what kinds are composed. So you have to tell the application CRD what kinds of objects to go look for. And this, because this is labeled different, this is like, we'll find any object and that it's similar to the GC controller. It's looking at everything, and it picks out the ones that it cares about and drops their status here. So that's the biggest current design difference, I think, with the application CRD, that and the fact that this has no spec and no like metadata about it. So it says this is on this operator and it does this thing.
Yeah, I played a little bit with the application CRD in developing the declarative library, and the nice thing is like when you are the operator defining the object, like you do know all the types that you're probably going to touch. But I think at this point, like when I picked it up, this was like 6 months, a year ago. When I picked it up, it was like, okay, I'll use this API, but the controller is not there. Like the actual support wasn't that interesting at the time. Maybe that's changed, but maybe it hasn't. It could be something that we just use as an API and extend, or we could just do something else too.
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely an option for this type of thing. But I guess my only real concern there is like, is there a problem with installing add-ons but having them show up as quote-unquote applications? Is that, to me, that's not an issue, but maybe that is an issue to some people.
I think it's considerable, like, question from the UX standpoint, and I think some of the answers there would be to differentiate the applications using labels or categories or an annotation with a API group or something like that.
Gotcha. That actually reminds me that another difference is that the application CRDs, CRs are namespaced, whereas the idea of this was to be cluster scoped because presumably add-ons affect the whole cluster. So we could potentially pitch this as like a cluster application, and that's enough different that we can work with SIG apps to do that.
That would be a great approach, I think. And we also we don't have we don't currently have clear guidance on whether our add-on operator CRDs should be namespaced or not. But yes, if we establish that guidance that typically they are singletons and certainly cluster scoped, that's cluster add-ons, and therefore they have a cluster application, that is a nice approach. But yeah, then the figuring out what is happening with the application CRD is probably a good next step. And the cluster application is a nice way to say we're sort of different, but we want to play nice.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, that's a good. I'll go to the next SIG apps and see where we are. Oh, one thing you said though, I wanted to come back to. I think that in the past it was possible and reasonable to write cluster extensions that didn't affect the whole cluster. But I think that with all of the features around CRDs as they are now, specifically the conversion webhooks, I no longer think that's super reasonable. I think that if you have a controller and you're using a CRD with all of the current CRD features, you pretty much have a global single. So if that's the strategy for add-ons, then I think it's not unreasonable to say that add-ons are cluster scoped. That's not to say I don't think you should be able to do that. I think there should be a good way to do non-cluster scoped controllers, basically.
Yeah, I think I agree. I think it's just we have not to date written that down anywhere. That probably the default should be not named. If when you're doing a cluster add-on, you should default to not namespaced.
Right.
Yeah. That makes sense.
Yeah, that whole cluster prefix verbiage I'm realizing is quite unfortunate because it conflates with the naming scheme of most other things. It's like somebody looking at these API objects all together, trying to figure out what is a Kubernetes is like, oh, so is there an add-on and a cluster add-on? And that's a scoping thing.
That's totally fair.
One has a namespace and one doesn't.
Mm-hmm.
So that's something to be careful of, because there's already patterns with that use that naming, and the naming means something with like role binding and cluster role binding. I'm just like trying to be like very careful and like thinking about the architecture and like what this will look like externally to the newest person that's trying to operate a cluster.
Yeah.
Because if we have this parallel work going on with SIG apps and we're not talking to them, and we build the same thing sort of, but like not, and we have all of these objects, and there's maybe even like another CLI tool that like, so now there's these differing CLI tools that work with these differing abstractions to aggregate statuses and expose specs to operators that are doing things in the cluster. I don't think like uniformity is like the first goal, but we should consider, right, like how we can keep things most simply expressed.
I think uniformity in this area would be a huge win for Kubernetes in general. Like having, if there is a way that you could talk about controllers with one language, I think that would be really useful. I don't think they have that.
Yeah. Want to try to prevent the 12 competing standards XKCD problem. So the very, like prefacing any of the work that we have done like in this group, there were already, tools. People were already doing things. We talked about potentially adopting some of those things. That was a complicated conversation. Pick some simple things to move forward with. How do we keep it simple? But then enable the richness and the flexibility and the extensibility that something like the deployments API has done for people running all different kinds of workloads, right? The deployment is 3 abstractions up from the pod. Right? You have the pod replica set to deployment, but nobody ever writes a replica set these days, right? Nobody is trying to deploy a bunch of web servers with 7 pod objects. They're using the deployment to run controllers, to run batch processing things that exit early, to run web servers, to run compute services with no networking needs whatsoever. How do we build that for an add-on that has the namespace and cluster namespace use case, that has the ability to polymorph on different API objects and expose status, and be useful for somebody, but simple, and so attractively simple and so useful that people actually adopt it. Anyway, I guess like your question that opened up that conversation was, okay, well, if we build this thing, like, are people going to be mad or are they going to be happy? And I think that I would like to see it. And I also echo Justin's comment, which is that the UX and the use case is probably the most important part. Because we can solve performance issues and we can solve awkward code library problem. But if it's not the right UX and it's not driven by that use case, it might be kind of lame.
Yeah. Great. I think we have a couple ways forward here to just keep exploring. So we can go talk to the SIG apps people and see what do they even still care about application CAD, or is anyone still doing any of that to start with? And then if so, can we collaborate? Is this the same use case that they're considering or not? And I don't know that we necessarily need to block on prototyping this, because I think this is probably like a day or two of dev time to just get something out and play with it and just see, like, is this doing what we think it's doing, and is it useful the way we thought it would be useful? And then both of those two approaches, I think, will inform how we go forward.
Yeah, I mean, if that's a day or two of dev time, then I can just speak on behalf of everybody who's joined this call. Thank you for providing the person who's capable and available to do that. Because
I volunteered, Nick. So.
Nice. Thanks for stepping up to do that, because the number of people in the world who could do that in less than a month is very small.
It gives me a lot of Marty.
I'm gonna say, yeah, this is like this is a stone's throw from stuff we do in LLM. So it's like we're literally just like, we don't want to be off on our island anymore. We want to like contribute to stuff, and that's kind of where we're like, yeah, we can find the small pieces that other people want to, and so this is a small piece that other people want to. That's kind of like
yeah. I think with the OCI bundling KEP, like that's a huge example of like something where it's like everyone's like raising their hand, like, oh, that looks good. So yeah, the mentioning like joining a SIG apps call, I've personally never really done that. So if somebody wants to take point on that and be nice to them and let them know that we're thinking about this, then we can hopefully open up the door for any kind of crosstalk or collaboration there, just so that we don't end up with something that nobody's not coming.
Does anyone go to the KubeBuilder one?
I have not been to the KubeBuilder in a little bit.
It's an unfortunate time, right? Because it clashes with Cluster API.
Okay. I was just thinking it might be good to start getting some crosstalk there as well. I probably can't do all three.
Yeah. Well, one thing is we've already started that relationship, and so yeah, people like Sully have been advocates of what we're doing in this. I keep wanting to call this sub-project a working group, because it's really turned into significant effort. Yeah. Cool. Well, to me, prototype sounds cool. Yeah. And then just thinking about whatever that UX would be, right? So if it's going to be kubectl, then the table it spits out needs to, show good information and that kind of thing. And then what is like the packaging UX from like a maintainer or developer perspective? And then that probably solves both of those stories.
Yep. I think we have a core DNS operator as a good example.
Yeah. Very cool. And there's that huge doc about core DNS operator alpha. It's got a bunch of good looking features in there. So, all right. Well,
Cool.
hopefully there's some action there. I will try to put these things in. So one would be talk to SIG apps, and then build prototype. Demo at some point. You mentioned maybe next meeting or the meeting after.
Yeah, I don't know when the next meeting will be. Are we doing anything for? Doesn't it fall like on Thanksgiving, or am I missing out?
Yeah, our next Tuesday meeting, I believe, is the 3rd. Oh wait, no, not the 3rd. I mean, that's on the 10th.
Oh, okay.
And I don't know if we'll do meeting after that, because that's going into December. Most people will not want to be on a call Christmas Eve in the US here. So we can probably skip one.
I think the next one is the 10th.
Yeah, we have the 10th, and then the one 2 weeks after that would be the 24th.
Gotcha. Yeah, that's
Which
probably
is, we'll
Yeah,
cancel
let's
that
skip.
one. And
Yeah.
then we can pick up another meeting on probably the 7th, right? So that's well into the new year.
Sounds
And
good.
we're doing the same thing actually for the for component standard. So
okay.
I mean the same dates. I will make a note that those meetings will be skipped.
I can do that. Do you want to go ahead with your? You want to talk about your Cube ADM PR?
Yeah, I suppose if we have finished the discussion, got the action items down for the add-on CRD stuff, I can talk about that.
Evan, are you happy?
Yeah, I think we're good. Thanks.
Cool.
Sweet.
Thanks so much to everyone, by the way, for just continually really creating and contributing meaningful work in this area. It's really appreciated. So this is real open source stuff. All the people in governance. So we just had KubeCon. I chatted with a bunch of folks about add-on installer, and this has been where I've been contributing the most technical area of contribution for me personally, and folks are positive. They have positive reactions about like having a component config that lets people install arbitrary bundles of things in some supported manner when composing with things like Cluster API. And so we've got this PR, which I mentioned in the SIG cluster lifecycle update, which has the majority of working implementation. And there's a few to-dos that I've listed, but in general, this should be a pretty good starting point. The Kubernetes maintenance team is aware of this feature. We had a triage call where we decided not to ship it in 1.17. I believe I may have mentioned that before KubeCon. If you'd like to read it, it's not that much code, and it shows how the library can be used. The great thing is that once it is instrumented into a function feature that ties into the config and the flags and whatever kind of installation experience the installer tool provides, once it's instrumented, you can bolt on and change a lot of behavior by upgrading the library. So that's a nice separation. And this might be informative for a COPS implementation, since some of the things that Kubernetes has that are easy to instrument with, like maybe exist in other ways or don't exist in an installer like COPS, which has a different approach to config. And yeah, so hopefully this can ship at some point in 1.18. It's definitely high on my priority list.
Do you need any help with any of the to-dos?
Probably the most helpful area, aside from just if somebody wanted to jump in and learn the code, I'd be happy to pair with them, would be like, I'm excited about the core DNS design doc, because that is something that we can immediately use, right? It doesn't require really a lot of external configuration, and we can just take the bundle of that thing and then apply it using the add-on installer. And it's important, like if you're going to ship this alpha feature, right, people are going to look at it and be like, oh, hey, can I use that? Should I use that? And for it to actually do something that provides value is exciting. So same thing, I could definitely use help kind of with the patching problem, if somebody would want to pair program with me on the patching. Different approaches to that would be vendoring the library or doing that weird file system thing we were talking about earlier. Or, yeah, attacking the kubeproxy operation issue. Right. There are definitely areas where it's unclear what the best way forward is. I've thought about using the inline patch, developing the inline patch feature into the API so that kubeadm has a simple interface to default a custom version of that patch when it installs the API. What am I saying? When it installs the add-on, it can build an add-on API instance, right? That inline patches the kubeproxy config, that kind of stuff. There's other difficult things to deal with inside of like trying to do customized patches where it's like you're trying to indirect into a config map and it just doesn't like you to do that. So not super sure what some of the best ways to handle these things are.
Unfortunately, we've run out of time. I don't know if there's another meeting in this room now. Would it be okay if we move the discussion to Slack maybe?
Yeah, sounds good to me. I will leave a comment in there.
Yeah, please. Yeah, please do. All right. Any quick last words? Okay. Bye, everyone. It was great to see you again.
Thanks, everyone.